Well, welcome back to Scuttlebutt Lodge. And I want to share a few stories with you today as I ask the question, has our reality become artificial? And I have three little anecdotal stories from over the years that I'd like to share with you. The first one is I had a reporter once at one of my protests at the sawmills in Lanark County when the government was trying to close the sawmills over sawdust. And we had this protest. The media was there. And in particular, there was one young reporter who had recently been hired by the Ottawa Citizen to come out. She came out to cover this protest. And at the protest site, we had these phony grave sites created out of sawdust. And this young lady asked me, she said, Mr. Hillier, what is all that stuff on the ground that looks like a gravesite? And I said, well, that's sawdust. And of course, we were at a sawmill. And she says to me, she says, well, where does it come from? And I was a little bit perplexed. And I can't say that I wasn't chuckling a little bit when I got that question. And I said, well, it's what happens when you saw a log, when you use a sawmill. You create these small particles of wood chips that we call sawdust. And, of course, she then understood. I was a little bit surprised that she couldn't make the connection, but what the term sawdust actually was, being at a sawmill and at a protest over sawdust. But regardless, that was one of the first times I started to question myself and ask myself, are people so far removed from the natural world that even after being in university for 4 years taking a journalism course, I couldn't figure out what sawdust was? However, there's more. The second story I want to share with you is my time in the legislature. I used to go to a little pub near my apartment called the Fox's Den. And I met one fella, he was about my age, he was middle-aged, he was an insurance adjuster. And one day when we were having a beer, it came up and he said to me, Randy, he says, there are no trees larger than 6 inches in diameter left in our country. We have raped and pillaged the land, and there is no more natural environment, and we only have little trees smaller than 6 inches left. And of course, I laughed and chuckled, and I said, are you really serious? And he was serious. And that, again, puzzled me how somebody could come to this conclusion that there were no trees in Canada larger than 6 inches. But then it dawned on me sometime afterwards that this fella lived in a high-rise condominium apartment in Toronto. Probably every day he'd get up, take the elevator downstairs, get out of the apartment building, and then possibly walk a little bit on the sidewalk. And in the Toronto sidewalks, you see these small little saplings planted in the concrete sidewalks, and they're not very thick. But then he would go to the subway station, and of course, you're not going to see many trees in the subway station. And then he would get off the subway at his destination, and then he went up to the 30th floor of his high-rise office building and do his day's work, and then repeat the process in reverse to go home, with a little detour sometimes to the Fox's Den. So in his world, I began to understand, in his world, there were no trees larger than 6 inches in diameter. So he was being honest. He was also had a very small field of view and perspective of what the world is and what is out there in the world that he is unaware of. But the third story that just happened recently, and this is why I had the picture of the chickens on at first. we had three young girls from Toronto come up and stay at the camp recently. And as many of you know, my chickens are free range. They have they're free to go anywhere, but they don't like to go too far away. So my wife came out to give the chickens some treats, some leftover tomato pieces and some watermelon rinds. The chickens really like tomatoes and watermelons, and of course she called the chickens over, and the chickens came to get their treats. And one of these young girls was watching this, and she was near in tears as she was watching my wife feed the chickens. And Jane says to her, "Well, what's the matter?" And she says, "I have just never seen a real chicken before," and she was just being so innocent that she had never seen a real chicken or people feeding real chickens. And then she began to ask Jane, and Jane had to explain that, because she didn't know that there was a difference between some of the chickens. Some of the chickens are hens, and one of the chickens is not a hen, but a rooster. So Jane had to explain that there are male chickens called roosters and female chickens called hens. And she also had to explain that it was the hens that laid the eggs, not the rooster. So stitch those three stories together, and what do you conclude from this? And it should be obvious to many people that a great many people, their reality is artificial. They are living in artificial cities with artificial lakes, with artificial parks or forests, artificial forests called parks. They're living an artificial life and are unaware about sawdust, trees, and chickens, but they are very much aware of technology. And even now, we see that the technology is being called virtual. They are trying to convince you that the artificial world is the real world. And that leads you into the next step. And I'm going to include a link to this. The Canadian government's and all our governments' interest in and promotion of the bio-digital convergence, where technology and humanity are fused together. And that is, it might sound scary, it may sound science fiction to you, but our government is actually promoting it, and I encourage you to take a look at the links in this video for it. So have a lovely day. I'm going to stay in the real world here in Lanark County with the real chickens and the real trees and the real gardens, and try to keep away from the artificial reality as much as possible.